Chapter 9, the Village of Cambridge and its Early Settlers. In 1761, the Cambridge patent was granted to Isaac Sawyer, Jacob Lansing, and others, embracing 31,500 acres north of the Hoosick land grant. It was known as Sawyer's and Lansing's Purchase, and included the Cambridge Valley of the Elmkill, the northern two-thirds of the present town of Cambridge, and a portion of the present town of Jackson. A village grew up on lot number 9 of that tract, or that portion of lot number 9 which had belonged to James and Thomas Morrison. It developed at the three crossroads where the Lansingburg Turnpike intersected the road to Saratoga, where the Shunpike enters Cambridge 3/4 of a mile east of that, and where the Arlington-Aranaquasset Turnpike crossed the Ash Grove and Pumpkin Hook Road a half-mile further east. This last settlement was known as Dorr's Corners. Prior to the Second War for Independence, the War of 1812, Cambridge was behind White Creek Village in business enterprise, but in the years that followed, because of its more central location, its position on the Lansingburg Turnpike, and the completion of the Troy and Rutland Railroad in 1852, it grew to be the chief village of the town. Settlement of the village undoubtedly began in 1761, and by 1765 there had arrived a sufficient number of Presbyterian persuasion to warrant sending to Scotland for a minister. Accordingly, the Reverend Mr. Telfair arrived the following year and preached to them. The old yellow meeting house, which stood on a lot adjacent to the old burying ground on the turnpike, just south of the village, was their place of worship. It was not fully completed until 1783, and was built on land given by William Smith, an early Cambridge settler. Reuel Beebe, an early settler, kept a tavern where the Presbyterian church stands. Adonijah J. Skinner's Tavern, erected in 1795, stood on the opposite corner. It was subsequently raised an additional story in height in order to provide room for the Masonic order, and this was said to have given the house a tall, quaint appearance. See sketch on page 39. Major John Porter was its proprietor until about 1815, and it was afterwards known as Comstocks, and lastly as the Fenton House. The 4-story brick hotel on the opposite corner was originally kept by James Furwell about 1840, later being known as the Irving House. In colonial times, the tavern was kept at the turnpike crossing by a Mr. Peters, and later by Aaron Chase. In an illustration on page 39, this hotel is shown as it appeared not long after the Civil War, when it was known as the Union Hotel, it having been much improved by the management of the Fentons. It was destroyed by fire in 1875. Dr. Jonathan Dorr came to Cambridge before the outbreak of the Revolution and built an elegant mansion in Georgian style, which was subsequently owned by Dr. Henry C. Gray and the Andersons. The present owners, Mr. and Mrs. Randall, acquired the house from the Anderson estate. This house has 9 fireplaces. The woodwork throughout is of the finest craftsmanship, and handmade molding is generously used in the exterior. The doorway, a masterpiece of the woodworker's art, is said to have been much coveted by the late internationally famous architect Sanford White, whose offer of $1,000 cash was refused for it. The house was completed in the year 1779. This section of Cambridge was long known as Dorr's Corners, and Jeremiah Stillwell kept a mercantile establishment here in the early pioneer days. Rice and Billings, also Eddy and Brown, were merchants here. On the site of the Brick Hotel was the former store of Paul Dennis, who was also once postmaster. Adonijah Skinner, the tavern keeper, was the first postmaster when that service began in 1797. The Elmkill and a small tributary of it flow through the village, but afford no useful water power. For this reason, the village did not develop as a mill center, as White Creek and Pumpkin Hook did, but seed factories, sash and blind factories, machine shops, and other enterprises not dependent on water power substituted for these. In 1836, S.W. Crosby was engaged in the seed business in the Tracy Building, and a house at Dorr's Corners, the enterprise having been started in Coila by Simon Crosby in 1816. Roswell Rice was also in the seed business in Cambridge at this time. In 1844, R. Niles Rice, who had been working up a seed business in Salem, acquired the interest of Roswell Rice and the Crosbys, and his son, Jerome B. Rice, shortly thereafter laid the foundation for the present business, the chief enterprise of the village. This concern employs a large number of men and women, and their product is sold throughout the United States. John P. Putnam, a grandson of Israel Putnam of Revolutionary War fame, came to Cambridge in 1812 and began the practice of law. In 1813, he married Elizabeth, the daughter of Dr. Dorr. Mr. Putnam owned the famous Pitcairn pistols, which fired the first shots of the Revolution. They had been presented to his grandfather and were carried by him throughout his service in the War for Independence. Towards the year 1840, a foundry was in operation on the site of the Presbyterian Church, run by S.W. Warner and Levi Tilton. It was moved to the site of Lovejoy's blacksmith shop, and the firm was known as Warner and Lovejoy. In 1861, the location was shifted to the banks of the White Creek, east of Dorr's Corners. Here, sawmill machinery was subsequently manufactured and shipped throughout the world. The church history of the village of Cambridge is practically equivalent to a history of the village. So great was the role of churches in the everyday life of the times. The difference among the Presbyterians in matters of ritual soon after the planting of the first church, which had been formally organized in 1769, resulted in a division of the original congregation into three separate bodies, each of which built its own church edifice. The separation stemmed from the three distinct classes of early settlers. Says the Reverend M.S. Fales in his historical review of the Presbyterian Church. There were the dyed-in-the-wool old Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. There were also Presbyterians whose Presbyterianism had never been so rigid, and was inclined to be still less so by reason of previous marrying among the Puritans of the New England colonies. And finally, there were the New England Congregationalists, or greatly modified Presbyterians. The first group to withdraw from the Mother Church organized the Quarlet Church in 1785. The second defection broke away in 1792. These were the people of New England background and influence, and they built their house of worship on the site of the old Beebe Tavern. The original edifice, begun in 1792, gave way to a larger, more commodious building built in 1832, which still stands now used for church purposes. In 1872, they completed the building on the opposite side of the street from this former church, adjacent to the park, and this is their house of worship today. The congregation, which remained with the Mother Church, organized according to law January 7, 1785, under the name of the First Protestant Presbyterian Congregation of Cambridge, and at some time now not ascertained, organized a church by the name of the Associate Reformed Church of Cambridge, and in 1791 settled the Reverend John Dunlap as their minister. The old building on the turnpike became dilapidated. In 1845 it was abandoned, and the brick church in the village built. The Embury Methodist Church of Cambridge Village may properly claim to have had its origin in the second earliest Methodist church in all America, Philip Embury's Ashgrove Church, which was planted in White Creek in 1770. The history of the Ashgrove body is detailed in our account of that part of the town in another chapter. In 1836, the Embury Church building was completed. The Baptist Church of Cambridge was organized in July 1843. This little band, says the Reverend Thomas Cole, must have had great faith, for there were already 5 organized churches within about a square mile. In 1844, they built the church edifice in which they now worship. St. Patrick's, the Catholic Church of Cambridge, had its origin in 1839, when the Reverend J.B. Daly celebrated Mass in the house of James Conity. This body met from time to time in private homes, and in 1853 the Reverend Father Quigley began to build the present St. Patrick's Church edifice, completed in 1855. The movement which resulted in the formation of the Episcopal Church of Cambridge began in August 1866, with a meeting at Woodworth Union Hall in which the Reverend Charles S. Hale, rector of St. James, Arlington, Vermont, officiated. The church edifice was completed in 1870, and the number of communicants has grown steadily year after year. For the detailed historical background of the various Cambridge churches, which our limited space does not permit of, the reader is urged to read an account of Old Home Week, Cambridge, New York, published in 1916, bound with a blue board cover, available at the local libraries. The Cambridge Public Library had its beginning on the 26th of January, 1793, when 45 of the leading citizens of Cambridge Village met together and organized this time-honored institution. In 1802, its administration was taken over by the Cambridge Washington Academy, and after the passing of that institution, it was conducted in connection with the Union Free School District. Among the library's earliest subscribers, we find the following names: William Skinner, Philip Smith, William Waite, Peter Whiteside, John Forrest, William Cooper, William Hay, John Whiteside, Benjamin Cook, James Bell, Samuel Dennis, Caleb Gifford, Thomas Whiteside, Joseph Durham, William McCumber, Amos Freeman, Jeremiah Thomas, John Gifford, Isabel Duffy, Abijah Sherman, Isaiah Gogold, George Allen, Darius Bordwell, John Allen, William Whiteside, Thomas Ford, Amasia Tabor, John Dunlap, Calvin Skinner, Edward Whiteside, Daniel Beadle, George Barber, Marshall Beadle, Oliver Whiteside, John Crocker, Laban Allen, Samuel Cook, Oliver Sherman, Garrett Ford, Samuel Thomas, and Paul Dennis. Between 1818 and 1866, a part of Cambridge Village east of the Turnpike was known as North White Creek. The part east of that continued under the old name of Cambridge. After White Creek was set off as a separate town in 1816, a separate post office was established, which brought about the change of name. Copies of the Washington County Post printed between those years carry the North White Creek date line. When the village was incorporated in 1866, it was possible to return to the original name. The division of the town in 1816 brought about some ill feeling among the older inhabitants, those for and against, but of this old controversy no bitterness survives today. The Washington County Post, the oldest weekly newspaper in the United States with continuous publication, is a White Creek institution. This newspaper's right to claim an unbroken succession to the first successful newspaper published in Washington County in the year 1788 cannot be challenged. The Times and National Courier was acquired by the Washington Patrol, which was printed on the same press and from the same type. The name was changed to the Northern Sentinel, then to the Northern Post, and then to the Washington County Post. The publication has endured week after week for 172 years. Its name has been changed from time to time as it has its place of publication, and many are those who have occupied the editorial chair. On the map, page 62 of the printing office of the Post is indicated on the south side of the street where the railroad crosses Main. Its publisher at that time was Mr. R.K. Crocker. On November 17, 1865, it was acquired by Mr. James Smart, who for a time published the paper along with Henry Noble. In 1875, the Post moved into the building it occupies today. About 1933, Charles John Stevenson became the editor. In the fall of 1959, Gardner Cullinan, who had succeeded Mr. Stevenson, acquired the paper and is its present editor and publisher. The White Creek Historical Booklet has been produced in the plant of the Post using the litho process, Mr. Cullinan having recently equipped his plant for this type of work. That's the end of Chapter 9.